and get started now. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Roxanne Adler-Hickey and I'm the Interim Director of the W&M Washington Center. On behalf of W&M, I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's webinar entitled Hindsight 2020, The Unprecedented Year. Our incredible panel will be discussing how lessons from 2016 may drive journalism and election coverage leading up to the 2020 election. And we all know it has been an interesting year, giving us plenty of things to talk about tonight. I'm joined by the Washington Center team, Erin, Reese, Elizabeth, and Gabe. Molly, who's actually out on maternity leave, but we look forward to having her back as early as next week. If you haven't met them yet, I hope you get the chance to do so because they are truly a phenomenal group of dedicated W&M employees who work so hard to support students in DC all year round. Tonight's event, as you may know, is taking place in lieu of our annual fall fundraiser. We typically hold a mug night benefit each fall to support the Study in DC Scholarship Fund. But this year, since an in-person event wasn't possible, we are incredibly grateful to our presenters for allowing us to still produce what we think will be an incredible event experience to engage all of you, which is students, alumni, family, and friends with the W&M Washington Center. Our center runs Study in DC opportunities all year long so that current students can learn in DC from experts like the ones you'll hear from tonight. These programs rely heavily on alumni as speakers and mentors, even internship supervisors. They offer our students high impact experiential learning with W&M faculty that can be and has been life-changing. These opportunities to learn in DC with and from alumni and experts open doors and solidify career paths. But we do see an increasing number of students who want to participate and can't because they don't have the means. But thank you to the generous support of many alumni, and in particular, our Washington Center Advisory Board, many of whom are here tonight. We continue to grow our scholarship fund and support more and more students each year. The work is not done though, and so we do need your help. At the end of tonight's session, you'll have the chance to briefly hear from a current Study in DC scholarship recipient, and we'll ask you to consider making a donation yourself. Anything you do give will go directly to our students so they can engage with faculty, alumni, and experts in DC, just like you were doing tonight. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce to you the David and Caroline Wakefield Term Associate Professor of Government, Jaime Settle. Jaime, if you don't know her, is amazing. Jaime not only teaches at W&M in Williamsburg, but she's also been teaching in the Washington Center since 2015, both in the semester program and the summer institutes. She's actually teaching with us right now, and her current students are here tonight. So welcome, students. Jaime is also the director of the Social Networks and Political Psychology Lab, co-director of the Social Science Research Methods Center. She's the director of undergraduate studies in the Data Science program. So she obviously does quite a bit, and our team simply adores Jaime. And so do all of her students and the ones that are here tonight, and I think you'll see why. So I am honored to introduce you to our moderator tonight, Professor Jaime Settle.
Well, thank you so much, Roxanne. That was a really lovely introduction. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I find my work with the DC office to be one of the most intellectually engaging part of my jobs, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation here tonight. As Roxanne alluded to, this moment in history just feels really different. In addition to experiencing the biggest public health crisis in a century, we're in the most intense period of racial reckoning we've seen in recent years, driven by horrific and persistent problems in the criminal justice system. And even before all of these events that have rocked us in 2020, pundits and political scientists were sounding the alarm about a concerning degradation of democratic norms in America. So on top of all of this, the manner in which the media has covered all of these phenomena has become something in and of itself that people are talking about as one of the problems facing our country today. Our primary goal for the evening is for everyone to walk away with a better understanding of what motives and incentives underpin media coverage about politics, and to think about the consequence of that dynamic on the kind of information that the public has about elections, as well as how the public thinks about politics more broadly. My role here as a moderator is to use my background in the study of political communication to ask thought-provoking questions of our two stellar panelists. We're extremely lucky to be joined by these two experts who have decades of on-the-ground experience participating in and studying the intersection of media and the politics. Our first panelist is Sophia Nelson, a former practicing attorney with the law firm of Holland & Knight LLP, and she is a former House Congressional Investigative Committee counsel. She is an award-winning author of 3 nonfiction books. Her latest book, E Pluribus One, Reclaiming Our Founders' Vision for a United America, is also a top Apple podcast called One America with Sophia Nelson. Nelson is also a former White House correspondent for Jet Magazine and is the winner of the Bernadine Stoneham Healy Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Inc. Journalism Award for her groundbreaking work with Essence Magazine. Sophia is presently an adjunct professor at Christopher Newport University in the Philosophy and Religion Department, as well as a frequent CNN legal and political analyst and a senior columnist for USA Today and the Daily Beast. Our second panelist, Nicco Mele, is a proud and dedicated William & Mary alum. He currently serves as managing director at the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation and is on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is faculty co-chair of the Harvard Council on the Responsible Use of Artificial Intelligence. From 2016 to 2019, Nicco was the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, an academic research center in the Kennedy School at Harvard University that examines media policy and innovation. Mele was previously a senior executive at the Tribune Media Company and deputy publisher at the Los Angeles Times, and prior, the founder and chief executive of Echo & Co., a digital and political consulting firm born out of the presidential campaign for Howard Dean. Earlier, he was the head webmaster for Dean's pioneering campaign. He has published widely, including the international bestseller, The End of Big, How the Digital Revolution Makes David the New Goliath, published in 2013. So we're excited to have you both with us. Thank you so much for joining us. We're gonna give you an opportunity to share some of your opening thoughts, focusing on things you'd like us to walk away from this discussion thinking about. And then we'll move to some questions that I've prepared ahead of time. But for everyone who's attending, we welcome your questions in the Q&A section. There should be a place for you to input your questions, and we will try to get to as many of those as we have possible. So I'd like to give our two panelists the chance to share your thoughts. What strikes you as the most important set of ideas to keep in mind throughout our conversation this evening? Sophia, we'll start with you.
First of all, thank you for having me, and your team has been delightful to work with. I'm honored to be here with Nicco and be able to share this time with your alumni and everyone, so I'm looking forward to that. But I think it's pretty simple, right? You nailed it in your title. This is a year like we've never seen before, at least not in my lifetime. And I don't think it's one that we're going to see again for a long time. At least I hope not. And I think that with the pandemic and this being a presidential election year, and we have this very unconventional president who I think I'll use the word is different. And I think that when those forces combine and you kind of look at where we started in January, the start of a new decade, the 2020s, right? And I think we were all very optimistic. I know I was really excited about this year for a number of reasons. And I think that as you come now to September and we're in the last quarter of this very different, very amazing, yet very sad and very challenging year in our nation's history, I think the things that we need to think about going forward are really, what is the state of our democracy? That's something I actually lay awake at night. I may be a nerd for this, but I lay awake thinking about this. What is the state of our country, and what's going to happen after November? What's going to happen leading up to? And I hope that Nicco and I will be able to shed some light on some things for you and give you some insights. But to me, the number one takeaway that all of us as citizens of this great republic have to walk away with is, what is the state of our republic right now in our country, and what can I do about it? What can I do to engage my community, my colleagues, my friends in making America safer, stronger, more united, and less divided? And I think that's really where I come down on this. Thank you.
Very powerful. Thank you. Nicco.
It's a real pleasure. You know, when I was an undergrad, I participated in the Washington program, and it was really a transformative experience for me. I remember meeting Senator Alan Simpson, who made quite the impression. So it's a real delight to be here, especially, you know, Sophia, seeing you on CNN, very fun to see you be on Zoom with you, a real honor. And Jaime, whose latest book I really enjoyed. I think it was quite a substantial piece of scholarship. So when I look at today's, when I look at the election as it currently stands, you know, the two things I would really want people to think about is, the first thing is, we're really operating in an unprecedented media environment, and between the collapse of local journalism and the rise of misinformation, and even revelations today from the intelligence community, including some of the president's own appointees, about the role Russia is playing on social networks to try and influence this election. I think we're just in a really volatile and unprecedented media environment, and media shapes public opinion. And so that makes it very challenging to really, I think, even understand what's happening in the country today in terms of public opinion about the election. The second thing I'd say is that, you know, my longtime mentor and favorite professor at William & Mary was Ron Rappaport, a professor of political polling, and he would probably kill me for saying this, but I don't want to trust the polling too much in this cycle. And that's not because of a hangover from 2016. What that really is we, you know, polling is first of all, never predictive, always a snapshot of the past. And second of all, it really is, you know, we don't know who's going to vote. COVID and the response to the pandemic, I think, throws a lot of the models for likely voters into some question. We just don't know. Will everyone vote the same way they did before, in the same numbers, or will the pandemic and vote by mail increase turnout, decrease turnout, have different effects of different populations? All of that makes it really hard to take the polling seriously, I think.
Yes, very, very thought-provoking, and I know my students have been thinking about that a lot as well. So let's rewind a bit. We've jumped right into 2020, but let's transport ourselves back to 2016. I'd love to hear your take on what you think the media did well during the 2016 election season and what it didn't do well. And Sophia, let's again start with you there.
The media did nothing well in 2016. That's an easy answer for me as a member of the media, as someone who writes and is on television. The media, tragically, and a lot of this has to do, you know, there's a lot of overlap here with corporate and those that lead the major networks and the cable networks. And look, like any other corporate executive, they want ratings, right? Donald Trump gives you ratings, folks. He gives you a lot of ratings. And people, as much as they like to make fun of him or call him names or think he's a buffoon or whatever they think, they like seeing it because it's like watching Celebrity Apprentice in action. And we have become voyeurs, right? We've become people that are hooked on our phones and our devices and our digital and our streaming and our televisions. And we like drama. Reality TV has shaped the generation, if you didn't realize it. The Real Housewives of Atlanta are favorites of a whole lot of people because they fight and they cause drama. And this gentleman that ran in 2015 and won in 2016 and is now our president for the last 4 years, he causes a lot of drama, and that drives ratings. So I'm disappointed in the media. And for it to be called fake news actually is ridiculous because the media has actually been more on this candidate and this president's side than people want to admit. And that's what scares me about right now. I agree with Nicco that I don't trust the polls. I don't know what people are going to do. I hear a lot of stuff. I see a lot of stuff. I look at yard signs. I look at what people are doing kind of undercover at the grassroots when I travel throughout the country before COVID hit. And I don't think at all that he doesn't have a chance to win this election. So yeah, I think the media failed in 2016 and it's not doing such a great job. It's doing better now, but it did a really bad job in 2016.
Okay. Nicco, what can you add?
I have two I agree with pretty much everything Sophia said, but I'm just going to drill down on three specific things. The first is that 2016 was one of the first elections we've had without really any local news. Local news has been dying over the last 15 years. And it had a pretty dramatic fall off between 2012 and 2016. And in fact, a Pew study at the end of 2015 showed that there are 22 US states that used to send a local reporter to Washington, D.C. that no longer do. And that's 22 US states that where a US senator in their years in the Capitol never get a question from a local journalist in the hallways. That's also 22 US states where there's no reporting on what this bill might mean for our community, what this presidential candidate's policy might mean for our hospitals, our schools, our roads. And so that collapse of local news creates a void. And the void is inevitably filled for the most part by three things: by social media, by talk radio, and by cable news. And I want to really focus in on cable news for a moment, because Sophia's right, the economic incentives are in cable news. Half of the money, cable news, it depends on the channel, but somewhere between 40 to 50% of their revenue is advertising. The rest of it is what they call carriage fees. Like basically $1 of your cable bill goes to MSNBC, and another dollar goes to CNN, and another dollar goes to Fox. And the way those carriage fees are negotiated are basically around who has the loudest supporters, right? What'll happen in a carriage fee negotiation every 5 years or so is that, Fox will say, well, we want $1.25 per month per household. And Comcast or Verizon or whoever the cable provider is will say, nope, sorry, you're not invited. Go away. And then they cut Fox off the network. You can't get Fox. But the problem is that all these Fox watchers will then call Verizon really angry and say they're going to cancel their cable. And the same thing happens with MSNBC and CNN. I'm not trying to single out Fox. All three of those networks, their incentive is actually to have a very small but very loyal base that will cause a stink if their cable gets, it causes stink during their carriage renewal. And so that creates certain economic incentives for types of coverage and narratives that really grab people and keep them kind of sucked into the narrative. And that's pretty unhealthy. I'll put in the chat a study by my colleague at Harvard, Tom Patterson. He looked at every single story published about the candidates and every single news topic. He basically rated them over time. And the coverage of the two major candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, during the general election after the conventions was overwhelmingly negative coverage of both candidates. They really couldn't find anything nice to say about either candidate. But most compelling, most interesting, is about 42% of the coverage is all about polling. Almost half of the news coverage was about polls. Why? Because polls are easy to report on. It's easier to report on a poll than to send a reporter to Wisconsin for 2 weeks. It's cheaper to report on a poll than to send a reporter to Pennsylvania for 2 weeks. And another 17% of the coverage in between the convention and the election was of controversy, overwhelmingly Hillary Clinton's emails and Benghazi, right? Those turn out to be real malpractice on the part of the national media. So one, we have a collapse of local news creating an information vacuum. Two, cable news is filling it, but their incentive is towards scandal and horse race. And then that spreads to other major media. And so they're not incentivized to actually produce quality news about the country. And then the third piece is social media. And this is where it gets really nuts. Some other colleagues of mine at Harvard, Yochai Benkler, did a really substantial study of misinformation on social networks during the election. And I'll put that in the chat too. It's a book-length study of social media misinformation during the election. And what they found was the two findings they had, and they looked at quite literally millions of pieces of social media posts in their audiences. And they found two findings. One is that the vast majority of misinformation was on the right, approximately 80%. Only about 20% of the misinformation was on the left. And their second finding was that the audience for that 80% of misinformation on Facebook and other social media was quite small, actually. But Fox News would pick it up and report on that misinformation. And then CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post would respond, creating an amplification effect. And that's how we get things like you probably, those of you with a firm memory of 24 months ago, recall the so-called caravan making its way through Central America to the US border. Didn't exist, total misinformation. Started on a conservative right-wing blog as essentially a conspiracy theory, gets picked up by Sean Hannity and Fox News, then CNN starts running segments about the caravan, but no one actually sends any reporters to find out if it's true or not. And so those are the three things I'd say about mistakes the media made. One is collapse of local news. So there's no reporting about what it means to me and my community. Two is the obsession with polls and scandals instead of quality reporting. And three is the amplification of misinformation from social media. Those are the three big mistakes of 2016.
So it sounds like
Jaime, you can tell me to shut up because I will filibuster all night long, and Sophia is much smarter than I am. So
I enjoyed listening to you.
Yeah, no, this is great, and I love the you both are bringing different but equally valuable kinds of evidence to this based on your experience. So it sounds to me like both of you are pointing to the business models underpinning the media and what drives what drives people's attention and interest, drives the economic models of what we see, and that then in turn affects the coverage. What do you think the consequence of this is? I mean, if you look back in 2016 or moving forward now, assuming that a lot of these things have stayed the same, how do you think these incentives and business models change the way that people think about politics?
Well, there was a story this week. I don't know if you guys saw it, and I'm going to get in trouble here because Jeff Zucker is my boss at CNN, but there was a story out this week about how Zucker and Trump were very close, right? And he helped him when he was at NBC with Celebrity Apprentice, and how people couldn't understand why CNN was allowing some very conservative, scary kind of types, people like Michael Caputo, who's in a whole lot of trouble right now, and others, Jason Miller, these people coming on the network. And so what you're finding out is, and it's not just Zucker, it's certainly at Fox, it's at MSNBC, Andy Lack tried to bring in more conservative. Greta Van Susteren, as you know, didn't do well. Neither did Megyn Kelly. She didn't do well because the basic NBC, MSNBC model skews more liberal. There's no doubt about that. So my point is that people are in alliances that, to Nicco's point, when you're a reporter, when you're a journalist, even when you're an analyst on television and a pundit, I don't care which side you're on, you ought to be about the facts, and you ought to be about good coverage on these candidates and getting to the substance of what they represent, what they care about, and what they're going to do for the American people. None of that happened in 2016, and he outlined beautifully why it didn't happen. And I think to your question about the corporate meeting the political, look at Facebook, right? Zuckerberg finds himself in trouble every other day because the corporate Zuckerberg likes all the money he's making from the Russian bots and the this and the that and the misinformation campaigns and the crazy left wingers and the crazy right wingers. It's money. And if I then have to allow the feds to come in and regulate, and I have to limit speech and I have to limit content, now I'm making less money. Folks, this isn't hard stuff. This democracy is in trouble. Now look, most republics have not lasted more than a few hundred years, right? Couple hundred years. We're at our test right now. We're being tested. And at some point there's this friction that happens and there's this kind of crash that happens, and we're experiencing that right now. So I'm sorry to filibuster as well, but I'm passionate about this, that the media has a job to do. And it's murky now at best because the corporate earnings are through the roof. Look at the money Fox News Corp makes. Rupert Murdoch, very wealthy family there, right? And so I'm going to do what drives ratings, and I'm going to do what drives my sales, not what's in the best interest of the public square. That's the problem as I see it. And it was 4 years ago, and it was 4 years before that, but it's really bad right now. And I think we all feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. Nicco, do you think there are other consequences of this clash of forces that Sophia's talked about in terms of how we think about politics as a country?
Well, actually, I think most Americans don't think about politics. About half of Americans don't vote in a presidential election. You get down to midterm and local elections, and in many local elections, you have single-digit turnout. And most, I think it was I have to look up the exact site. I think it's about a quarter of Americans don't want to read the news. They don't want. They're choosing ignorance. And I think one of the reasons, I would say the research shows one of the reasons they're choosing ignorance is the news isn't doing a very good job. It's all overwhelmingly negative. There is no path to solutions. They're stuck in ways of telling stories that with protagonists, antagonists in a fight that they've had for over 100 years. Very little kind of changes in narrative style. And and people's trust in news has declined, I think, in part because of the way lines have blurred. I mean, Sophia, are you do they on CNN, how do they introduce you, a commentator or an analyst?
Well, there are a number of titles. You get contributor, you get analyst, you get commentator, and sometimes there are people that are like the medical doctors that we all see right now with the COVID coverage. They are special correspondents or special medical. So there's all kind of titles, and all of them come with a financial price tag, and sometimes yes, sometimes no. But yeah, they have a lot of different ways to introduce you.
And in news lingo, in the professionalism of journalism, there's a distinction between these different gradations that Sophia mentioned, between commentator, analyst, and journalist. And but they all kind of blur together. And I watch a lot of cable news, and I can't even remember who's who and what's what, right? And I think that's the experience most Americans have. And so when they listen to news on TV or they read in the paper, they're not drawing a distinction between opinion versus reporting, but the journalists in the newsrooms are. Not that anybody pays attention. And I think it's a real kind of systemic flaw in journalism. I mean, a good example is Fox. Fox News has a really actually very strong reporting and investigative reporting unit. But they also have opinion, like Sean Hannity, that just spread conspiracy theories, falsehoods, and lies.
Yeah, I'd like
and
to
so,
follow up. I'm sorry, go ahead, Nicco.
No, go ahead.
No. I wanted to say to your point, I kind of want to push back a little bit on this notion that people aren't reading about politics or engaged in it. I agree that it's overwhelmingly negative and awful, But I think actually, particularly since the pandemic started, and it's the whole George Floyd, and I don't want to get ahead because I'm probably going to mess up your question, so I'll just hang back on that. But I want to push back. In Virginia, we've seen just the opposite. Women have driven big change in politics in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Our turnout has been record in every local election that we've had since 2017 and going into the national election in 2018 and again in 2019. And we've seen record turnout in local races because people are now going out and voting because they hate Trump or they dislike Trump or they like Trump, whatever the case is. And so the national politics is actually, at least here in Virginia, I can't speak to other places, but I know here in Virginia, women have changed. 2017, more women in the legislature, it flipped. We have a woman Speaker of the House, a woman majority leader. That's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And just 4 years ago, women were very not well represented here in the Commonwealth of Virginia at all. So I think it depends on where you are, but I know here it's changed dramatically.
So let's push on this a little bit before we go back to some other questions. I mean, I think this is an interesting contrast y'all are getting at. My impression is that some people feel like they've been overwhelmed the past 4 years with just the sheer volume of critically important stories. I mean, it's almost like there's some sort of fatigue or news exhaustion in the Trump presidency. But Sophia, you're correct. Empirically, we've seen record high turnout in the midterm elections, and it does seem like we've seen a resurgence of interest in political participation. So how do you what's involved in that trade-off? Do you think it's true that people are exhausted? And even if they're exhausted, how do you think it is that they're translating into participation?
I think that people are afraid, and I say that sincerely. Women got involved in 2017, right after Trump was elected. Why? Because they woke up and realized that they didn't go out and vote for the better candidate. Not to mention she was a qualified, well-qualified female, but as Nicco said, she had very high negatives. And the media there's no doubt that the media was biased against Hillary Clinton. Like her or not like her, the coverage of Trump gets caught on a tape saying things I won't repeat here. And we now find out the Russians were involved in our elections, and the Obama administration and others knew, but they were hesitant to bring it out for fear probably that people would say they were trying to interfere in the election. And I think what's happened is people are actually afraid. And that's why with women woke up and said, wait a minute, this guy got elected, the guy who said he was going to do what to women on a tape? And women got involved. They had the largest march ever, and women started mobilizing, and women woke up and said, man, we better never do this again. And they took over state legislatures. 2017, a lot of places turned blue. 2018, the House flipped from Republican to Democrat. The Senate got a little bit tighter. And then 2019, again here in Virginia, it was catastrophic for Republicans. Republicans in Virginia have not won a statewide election since 2008. And I don't see a good future for them anytime soon. So the thing is that I think that women woke up, and women are very afraid right now. And I think the country as a whole saw this and they reacted to it. I fully expect that there's going to be a large turnout in this election, to Nicco's earlier point. I don't know what happens if the pandemic, God forbid, gets worse, and in October, I don't know how it could get more worse than 200,000 dead Americans, but it's going to get worse. And I don't know what that does to people, but otherwise I expect a large turnout in this election. But it's just, maybe it's too early to tell yet.
So Nicco, I know you expressed uncertainty about this, but do you agree with this assessment that even if there are people who are tuning out the news, that those who continue to pay attention have had their emotions activated, and that's driving a lot of the engagement we're seeing?
Well, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in America who's paying attention to politics is undecided. I just think there's a huge percentage who aren't paying attention to politics and may not engage. I put in chat this survey that showed 38% of Americans often or sometimes avoid the news. They don't want to be, it's so ugly and crazy, they don't want to be engaged. And I put some of the blame for that on the media and some of it on our leaders who who don't engage on issues that matter. So I don't think there's anyone undecided in the United States. I don't think that means that. So I don't think there's anyone undecided who's paying attention. My qualification, but I disagree with Sophia about the Republican Party. There are three things that I think really play to the Republican Party is much stronger than it looks in the United States, and my argument would have three pieces. One is just the structural advantages, right? I mean, the way the Electoral College votes, or the way the Electoral College is structured, is favors red states. I mean, the system is explicitly designed by the founders and framers of the Constitution to structurally favor the minority in both the Senate and the Electoral College. And, you know, if you add demographics to it, in about 20 years, by 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. And that means that 30% of the population will pick 70 US senators. Yes, America is becoming younger and more diverse at a rapid pace. And these days, that means they're less likely to vote Republican. But that demographic change is only happening in parts of the country that don't matter in terms of Democrats' political power. So the first thing I would say is Republicans have real structural advantages. The second thing I would say is, just to repeat my earlier self, the information pollution out there is really toxic. And you know, if you want to try this for a week, make your only source of news for 1 week the following 4 sources. 1, Fox and Friends. 2, Hannity. 3, The Daily Caller, which is one of the publishers, one of the top 10 publishers on Facebook by audience. The Daily Caller has more readers than the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then the last thing I'd recommend is the President of the United States follows 46 people on Twitter, just 46. Follow those same 46 people and only them, and make that your source of news. If you do that, those 4 things, you begin to get a sense of how our president and a significant chunk of the American population experience the news and how it shapes their worldview. And it's why conspiracy theorists are winning Republican primaries. And we're going to end up with at least 2 or 3 avowed conspiracy theorists in the next Congress. We just breathe, eat, and live in a vast ocean of misinformation and media pollution. And you may not live in that ocean of media pollution, but that's because, you know, you're William & Mary. You're William & Mary alums.
Can I just say one thing? I want to be clear that Nicco's clear. I said Virginia Republicans, and I'm going to stick with that. The Virginia Republican Party's in trouble. It is. I'll argue that point with you all day. And I've written about this. I've experienced it. And demographic changes have hurt Republicans here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If the Republican Party cannot expand its reach and its base, and to your point with conspiracy theories and propaganda and QAnon and all this stuff that they ingest, watch Tucker Carlson one night and just watch what you will experience. It's like nothing you've ever seen before. Laura, and again, these are people I know that I considered friends once upon a time. And they went in a different direction. And this is, like he said, the news that people ingest. I have people in my family that have been infected by what I call I won't start calling names, but some of these networks and some of the very channels and outlets that Nicco named. I am literally concerned about these members of my family, because now they start saying crazy things. They start talking about fascism, and they start talking about they're angry all the time. It's really scary, and it's hurtful to see it happen to people that you care about. But if that's the lens by which you operate every day, he's right. They hate the New York Times. They hate the Washington Post. They hate the LA Times. They hate anything that is not Breitbart, The Blaze, Glenn Beck, Fox. Alex Jones, try him out. You want to listen to a real deranged person? Listen to Alex Jones. And he's been sued. You know, he said that Sandy Hook didn't happen. That's the kind of stuff that they ingest. So you're right, Nicco. We're operating in an ecosystem now. Politics, way different than it was just a decade ago before some of this stuff existed. And I agree with you writ large that the Republican Party, if we keep the Electoral College, as you know, there's a move to get rid of the Electoral College and go to the popular vote. But it'll be interesting to see, because you're right, 70% of our elected US senators will be chosen by red states, which means that it'll be very difficult for the coastal and where most of the country lives to elect, you know, a different looking Senate or a diverse Senate that has people like me in it. I mean, Kamala Harris is the only Black woman in the US Senate. She's only the second. And Cory Booker and Tim Scott are the other African Americans. If you went by population, you should have at least 13 Black US senators right now, right? 13%, 14% of population is Black. I don't see that happening anytime soon unless the South begins to turn blue, where most of the Black population is. So you're right. I mean, this is an important discussion, and I'm glad we're having it.
Sophia, can I ask you a question just about, I know it's probably anecdotal,
Sure.
but I have seen some research about the African American community online and their exposure to political misinformation and how it's shaping their political views to, you know, I think there's a myth in the media about kind of a uniform Democratic coalition among African American voters. And I don't see that online. And I just wondered what your analysis is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no doubt, Nicco, that 90% of African Americans in this country, particularly at the presidential level election, vote Democrat, okay? That other 10%, you know, John McCain had a very bad performance of 8%, but he ran against the first Black president, or 6% rather, and so he had the worst showing ever of any Republican, I think even worse than Goldwater. But that was because he ran against a historic candidate, not because Black people don't like John McCain. Had it been John McCain against some other Democrat, I think he would have done better with Black voters. Donald Trump got, he says, 15% of Black male voters, which I don't know. I need to see more evidence of that. We know how Black women vote. They're the most reliable base for the Democrat Party. So I do think that African Americans like myself, I've been a moderate Republican my entire life until Donald Trump became the standard bearer, and I'm not going to be a Republican as long as Donald Trump's in the party. I'm a never Trumper, like a lot of us who used to be, you know, Lincoln Project, take your pick, RPV, et cetera. There's a bunch of us. And I think that there are African Americans that grew up like me in the 80s and the 90s under Reagan and Bush, Daddy Bush, that saw Republican politicians as what we grew up under. So it was kind of the norm. I think this new generation of young people, however, I don't know how the Republican Party talks to them. They seem to be much more progressive, if you will. They believe in climate change and things that Republicans tend not to. So yeah, it's going to be interesting where Black voters go in maybe the next 10 years. If Republicans can win Black voters back, they're going to have to put people like Sophia Nelson up as candidates who can walk and chew gum in the Black community and have credibility, as well as talk to white voters and be able to connect on things like the Second Amendment and other things. But there are not a whole lot of those type of Republicans walking around right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things to keep in mind are these longer term projections, right, alongside these forces that seem to be pushing us further and further into our own bubbles, right? And so as we're watching these changes that we know are inevitable in terms of demographics, thinking about whether people are actually going to have access to that information. I mean, you both have pointed this, you know, topic has come up throughout our conversation thus far, but I want to tackle it more directly in terms of thinking about two interconnected things. So the first is you've both pointed to several personalities and shows on Fox News that we know are among the most popular of cable news hosts. And they've led, in many ways, Fox News to be the clear leader in terms of viewership. Political scientists study Fox News because it's been documented that watching Fox News is associated with a number of undesirable outcomes. I think most recently, you know, there's an increased likelihood of non-compliance with mask wearing and social distancing among Fox News viewers, even if you control for their partisanship. And so thinking about this, you know, what do we, whether it's information on Fox News or misinformation more broadly that people are encountering, what do you think we do about this? I mean, how do we tackle the misinformation problem given what you understand about what's driving people's interest in consuming misinformation?
I'll let Nicco go first this time.
You're gonna let me do the easy ones, huh? Well, I think the first thing is we have to recognize that misinformation is filling a void left by the collapse of local news. And so finding a way to encourage local news, finding a way to, you might say, to really help inform people about their communities is the long-term fix. I don't think that helps in the short term, because we got 20 years of economic collapse in the news industry, and you're just not going to fix that overnight. I definitely think that digital platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube have significantly abdicated their responsibility to society on this front. And I really believe that more people are dying in this pandemic because of that abdication. And I'll just tell you a story as a point of comparison. You know, shortly after World War II, Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time magazine and Life magazine, almost every American household got one of the publications he owned. And he hated FDR and the Democrats. He thought they were commie pinko liberals out to destroy America and apple pie. He thought they were really bad for the country, right? And you don't forget, Herbert Hoover called FDR a fascist more than once. And he wanted to go to war against FDR and the Democrats in his magazines, in his publications. But he's a little nervous about that because he had just watched Hitler use newspapers and radios and magazines to destroy the Jews and lead Europe to a terrible war. And so he's a little nervous. So he calls his friend Robert Hutchins, who's the president of the University of Chicago, and says, here's some money, go tell me where the line is. What are my obligations as an owner of the media? And there's a 2-year thing called the Hutchins Commission with 12 old white guys. And they have public hearings and what have you, and they publish the Hutchins Commission report on the freedom of the press in the United States. And the central conclusion of the report is that the media has the power to shape public opinion. And so it has special responsibilities to the democracy that other corporations do not have. And Henry Luce hates this conclusion. He thinks it's the worst money he ever spent. He's pissed, but he lives by it. And not only that, but the Hutchins Commission kind of ends up in, not directly, but it creates a whole bunch of discussion and research, what have you, and leads to a series of kind of public policies, including what we call the fairness doctrine, that really brought integrity to our news ecosystem. But for a variety of reasons I can get into at length, we repealed the fairness doctrine and deregulated the FM spectrum, both arguably good things with unintended consequences. And now we're living in an era where there is no public policy to encourage integrity in media like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And we're dependent upon the moral legitimacy, the moral compass of people like Mark Zuckerberg, and we have, I believe, very little evidence that that's a good idea for society.
You know, I think that we're in a position now where we're going to have to make a choice, like I said, about who we're going to be. The public square actually does matter. And I agree with Nicco that the media has a special responsibility, because in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights is freedom of the press. The free press, look at what the founding fathers say. By the way, let me stop, freeze. Today is U.S. Constitution Day. 233 years old this day in 1787, the Constitution was ratified, right? So it's important we stop and reflect on the underpinnings of this democracy. And it is our Constitution, one that has, if you're a strict constructionist, you want it just the way it was. Well, I don't want it that way because I'm 3/5 of a person and I'm a slave. I want the Constitution that's evolved. I want the Constitution that we have now, the living, breathing document that says that slavery is not something that we ever want to have. It says that all men are protected under the law. It says that black men have the right to vote, and ultimately with the 19th Amendment, women have the right to vote, etc. So it is this underpinning of who we are starts with freedom of the press. Think about that. The founding fathers back in their time, in the 18th century, when they write this document, there is no television, there are newspapers, and they certainly had their fights. Just go back to Thomas Jefferson and the race for the White House with John Adams. Go back and look, right? And so the fact that the press is mentioned by the founding fathers as having this special role, that it must always remain free and unfettered and be able to protect sources and be able to look at those who are governing and dissect them and expose them if necessary. There's a lot of great writing on this. My last book, I talk about this, E Pluribus One, and I think it's important that we understand that for the last 4 years, unlike any time ever in the history of our country, we've had a president systematically and systemically attack the press every day, make it illegitimate, call it fake, call it dumb, call it criminal, call it whatever you want to repeat that he said about the media. And again, if you're filtering your news through those outlets that Nicco talked about, right? You believe this. You believe that nothing the media says has credibility. And that's dangerous, because if the free press can't report the news and tell you that, as the FBI director said today in his testimony, the most dangerous threat to this republic right now, buckle up for this now, is not Black Lives Matter, and it's not Antifa. It's white supremacist terrorist groups. That's the biggest threat we have right now, according to the white male Republican FBI director, appointed by Donald Trump, just so you know. My point is that if we can't tell the story about what's going on, if we can't say that the Russians have undercut our elections, right? And believe that, and believe our intelligence agencies, and the president says it's fake, the president says it's a lie, what then do we rely on, Nicco? And I'll throw this to you. What do we rely on then if the fabric of our very important institutions, the free press being one of the big ones, is a lie and it's fake? What do we have left? I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. Nicco, do you have any thoughts immediately on that? It's a big question to throw at someone.
I think I've silenced Nicco. That's kind of
not easy to do, Sophia. I applaud you for that. I don't think I've ever seen Nicco speechless.
Seriously, Nicco, though, what do you think about that? I mean, I want to know, do you agree that the president has very effectively, he's made the media really a pariah in a way I've never seen before?
Well, he's made the media a pariah for sure. I mean, I agree with you on that. I also think it was underway for some time. So it does predate, it's a trend that predates the president, but he turbocharged it, certainly. And some of it is deserved. The media doesn't always do that great a job. In part, it's a hard job to do. I mean, I was top management at a top newspaper at the Los Angeles Times, and my sympathy for the decisions that journalists and business leaders of news publications have to make every day really increased substantially. But they also got stuck in a number of ways of reporting and acting that I really believe were damaging to the profession long term, and provided some legitimacy to the question of trust. But that still doesn't really excuse the president's behavior and his attack of the media. I mean, if we think about all the things we wouldn't know if it wasn't for the reporting about the country, about this administration, it's lunatic. But I do think at the same time, the president manipulates the media quite brilliantly. He knows the kind of storylines they can't resist. Just look at the giant volume of coverage last week of Bob Woodward's book and the feud between Bob Woodward and the president. Who cares? Like, did anyone actually learn anything from Bob Woodward's book? It's all stuff we know already, but the media couldn't stop talking about Bob Woodward and Donald Trump because that's their little club. Meanwhile, California and Oregon are on fire. Yep. The Midwest is having extreme climate. We got a hurricane coming, nothing about climate change. Or how about the US Census? Once every 10 years, and we're on the verge of a failed census that would dramatically affect American public policy for the next decade and really hurt poor people. And there was no discussion of that either. So the media gets trapped, and Trump knows how to do that. That's a particular part of his genius.
Yeah, we agree. I said that at the outset that he is, it's like, you know, I used to watch, you remember Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown had that reality show, and it was just awful. I mean, it was awful, folks. And if you ever watch it, you know, but I was addicted to it because I couldn't believe what I was watching. It was so outrageous. It was so ridiculous. And you know, Whitney's my favorite pop star. I'm a teenager kid of the 80s, right? And I couldn't believe this was beautiful Whitney Houston acting like this. And I think people are addicted to outrage over Trump, to what he does next. They wake up and they're like, what has that fool done today? And I can't wait to hear more about it. And that's not a good way to run a country. And I agree with you. The stories, I think to your next point, I'll let you get into that, Jamie, because I know you want to talk about the stories that aren't getting enough play. So I'll be quiet.
Well, we're getting some questions in from the audience, and I want to encourage people to keep sending those questions. I'm trying to integrate them in as I can. We've got a great question that asks, you know, what is journalists' responsibility to rebuild this trust that has been lost, and what's the role of citizen journalists in an era in which more and more people are equipped to be able to document and publicize what they're observing in the world around them?
I think that's a tough question. I am not a fan of the quote unquote citizen journalists. I think this started with the blog stuff where everybody had a voice and everybody had a platform. Now, I read it on Facebook becomes journalism, and it's not. These are not people that are trained. They don't have degrees, or they haven't studied this. They haven't practiced the craft of journalism and the rules and the regulations and the ethics. I'm a lawyer by trade. I can get disbarred, just so you know, not practicing law anymore, but I could get disbarred for saying something really bad on television that turns out to be malicious and false and whatever. Somebody could bring me up on a bar charge. So journalists have to have ethics and standards too. And now that you've got YouTube and everybody's got a phone and everybody's got a camera, you got a bunch of people running around making news, right, who aren't trained in how to do news, how to communicate news, how to share news, what is appropriate, what's not, what's malice, what's inappropriate, what's an invasion of privacy, what isn't. And I think that what we have to do is, but that ship has sailed, by the way. I don't think we can get the genie back in the bottle because everybody's got one of these. And this makes you a superstar now, right? I mean, let's face it, George Floyd video goes viral because some citizen, to their credit, actually had the ability to stand there and record something like that. I couldn't have. I would have been in the middle of it. I just know my personality. And, you know, they did it and it made world news. So in that instance, a citizen journalist was a good thing, right? But I'm talking about, like Nicco said earlier, about these outlets like Daily Caller and some others that I'm sure I'm not familiar with on the left, who are really just spreading crazy, nutty stuff that a lot of our senior citizens, a lot of our older people, people that live in certain areas of our country ingest every day. And they believe it. They believe that coronavirus, that COVID is a hoax. They believe, did you see the video of the people that ran in the Target and the anti-maskers and, you know, were jumping up and down and attacking people in the Target and they didn't want to wear their mask? There are people led on by the Attorney General of the United States who, by the way, yesterday equated what he calls a civil liberties snatch with slavery in this country. That's disgusting for him to say something like that. He believes that people like him and others who don't want to wear a mask, who don't want to abide by stay-at-home orders, are being treated like slaves. Are you kidding me? And that's the kind of stuff that these people watch every day and they go, yeah, that's true. So I think we're in a bad place, and I think we're going to need some reform. Nicco, I'll let you pick that up because you actually were, at the LA Times and as an editor, et cetera. So
I wasn't a journalist. I was on the business side trying to help them figure out how to make money to be more sustainable.
Worse.
I do think to the question, I think that one very practical thing you can do is support your local news, whatever that is. Maybe it's a local TV news. In most markets, your local news is generally a local TV news website. But whatever the local news provider is, support them. Another thing I recommend is, we need more communities to value local news and to invest in it. I'll put in chat a link to how you can start your own local news organization. I'm about to launch a GoFundMe campaign for a local news organization for the little town that I live in. And, I've also advised several local libraries that want to start some kind of local news as part of the library system, which I think is a really good solution. I mean, libraries are pretty significant parts of our communities, and I think a very good vehicle for local news, actually. But there's imperfect things with all of these solutions. I mean, one of the challenges of local news, that at the heart of local news is holding power accountable, and that pissing off powerful people is hard. It creates all kinds of issues. And the question of how to build a local civic organization focused on local news that also is able to hold power accountable is really quite significant and not easily answered. And I can also talk about that forever because I have a lot of things to say about that, but I'm cognizant of our short time.
So you both pointed to instances where citizens are or are not doing things to help themselves access good quality information. What's journalists' role here? I mean, we recognize that they're working within a broader system and that they're not entirely in control of all of these economic incentives and business models, but what should we be asking of our journalists as we move forward, given all of these problems that we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's an old Irish proverb, the fish stinks from the head down, right? And so we've talked about this a little bit here this evening, which is that if our news is being driven by corporate profit, corporate ratings, et cetera, in a way that, I'm old enough to remember Peter Jennings. I was a big Peter Jennings fan, A Gentleman, Tom Brokaw, these guys, different kind of newsman, right? If what's driving journalists now is what's the most outrageous story I can cover, what can I become a celebrity? You do know there was a story the other day, and I think it was the Washington Post, and Susan Page, who is with USA Today, she's our Washington bureau chief, was coming under fire because they're saying you can be a socialite or you can be a journalist, but you can't be both. And, they were going after Susan and a couple other of Washington's top leading women, right, who had these great parties, or they're popular figures on the circuit and having drinks at hotels with, the politicians. And what you're asking really is what the journalists can do. I would push back and say, I don't think that it's in their hands as much as it is in the hands of their bosses. And people respond to who signs my paycheck, what's the expectation of me. And I think that Nicco's spot on that we've lost the local news. We also have way too much noise. When Nicco and I were kids and we were growing up, you had ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was it. and your family watched the news at 5 o'clock, whatever, after dinner, or 6 o'clock, the evening news, and maybe again at 11, and it was local. That's gone. And so I sadly don't know how much control journalists have, because as I look at my peers and myself, we've become celebrity because people see us on TV and they stop us in the stores, and we get death threats, which is very common now, by the way, on social media. I have to have security. The model's changed. I'm not sure we're journalists anymore. I'm not really sure what we are. I think it's more celebrity, and I think that's the problem.
So
I agree. I definitely agree. It's a little too much about celebrity, but not just celebrity journalists, but it's kind of too much about journalists. I think all of our local leaders, high school principals, pastors, and leaders of synagogues and temples, sports, coaches, like, we need to hear from the leaders in our communities about the news, that the news matters, that you should trust the news, that the news does make mistakes, but on balance, it is a powerful force in our communities.
So the idea then is, if we think of media as a market, and the structural economic incentives that are there, as consumers, we have power collectively, right? We can change some of our behaviors. And so you could imagine that there's change from the bottom up. You also both have alluded to earlier the idea of government regulation. Nicco, you've pointed to instances in the past where you think government regulation has worked, and times where there have been some unintended consequences. I'm curious which you think is more likely to be successful in terms of pressuring the owners of media corporations to change their ways. Is it going to be consumers demanding that change, or is it going to be the government acting to try and push them in the direction we need to move?
I think at some point, perhaps consumers might have made a difference, but it's too late for that now. And I think what is required is some kind of government action. And there's not a specific government action that necessarily makes sense to me. There's a range of interesting things to consider. But at this point, I think it requires government action. And it could be indirect. It could be offering some kind of special philanthropic subsidy for news. I mean, there's a lot of interesting possible solutions, but we need something.
I agree.
So Nicco, you said there are some, we've had some interest in thinking about this regulation more. What do you think's worked well in the past? Or you alluded to something earlier, the unintended consequences of some changes in government action.
Well, certainly the fairness doctrine worked for a number of years to essentially to regulate and require integrity. Or I shouldn't say integrity, but a way they were trying to require integrity was you had to have fairness. You had to present both sides in equal time. So Sean Hannity would not be allowed to speak on air without presenting both sides of the argument. And it was relatively well regulated by the FCC. Now, I can't really imagine that practically working today, frankly, given the way the internet works. And so I wouldn't necessarily advocate for that. But I don't know, there's a lot of things to consider. For years, the Postal Service really subsidized local news by offering a very low rate to newspapers to use the Postal Service. And so maybe we should do something like accredited news organizations are exempt from your phone bill and your cable bill, from your streaming bill, right? That to incentive or download, like your bandwidth bill, to incentivize you to consume more news, to reduce the cost for them. That's an interesting idea. It alone is not sufficient. It doesn't significantly change the economics of it. I mean, I can't remember exactly. I was Googling it, trying to find it during this session, but I want to say that, we talk about National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting, PBS, but they're not really public. It's like roughly 8 to 10% of their budget, maybe even less, comes from government sources, and it is overwhelmingly philanthropically funded. And that puts us as a democracy and developed nation at the very bottom. I think we do something like, I want to say $1.75 per capita for news. The UK does $86, if my memory serves, per capita for news. $86, $1.75. And so we're really, it's really put us at a disadvantage that we don't have a more robust public media, public news ecosystem. I'll note that there's some interesting stuff afoot, that the New Jersey legislature has put a lot of money in the last 2 years into local news, because they have no way of communicating with people for simple things like schools are closed, for snow, and so they're putting tens of millions of dollars to build a real local news ecosystem in New Jersey. Raises a whole bunch of questions, I think, about ethics, accountability. Do you really want the government running the news? There has to be some separation between the funding and the news gathering. But these are all things that have really that other countries have figured out, right?
Yeah, I agree with him. I think he's spot on. I think that I'm not nuts, because I do value our civil liberties. I don't want, look, again, it's Constitution Day, right? And you think about our fundamental freedoms of speech. I may disagree with, I know Sean, I disagree with 99% of everything that ever comes out of his mouth. Same with Laura, same with Tucker. But I'll defend their right to say it, because that's how America works. But the problem is that now we want to limit each other's speech. So the right wants to say what the right wants to say, but they want to lock the left up, and they want them, some of the stuff that the Attorney General of the United States is advocating right now and saying about quote unquote leftist groups really translated means people who don't agree with me, right? And so I do agree that we have to get back to the local news and engaging people in the public square, which is the best phrase I can think of. We've lost our engagement in the public square that we used to have. Families used to watch conventions. Families used to actually pay attention to who was running for president or governor or senator or whatever. And we've lost that now, to the points Nicco raised earlier about it's so negative and it's so nasty now. People are just like, ugh. So I've decided, though, that if I'm Joe Blow Public and I watch Fox News, for example, anything that CNN says or MSNBC says or ABC or CBS says is fake news, right? And on the other hand, if I watch CNN, anything that Fox says is racist, it's garbage, it's sexist, it's, whatever word you want to use, right? So we put each other in these boxes now that we forget that we're Americans and that we're all supposed to be in this together. And I'm not a kumbaya kind of gal. That's not what I'm saying. I'm making a very simplistic point that we've lost our patriotism as a country in terms of what Nicco said about, I as a journalist, as a columnist, even more so, because those of us who sit on the pretty perch of being columnists really are in the ivory tower, right? If you look at most of your columnist writers for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Post, USA Today, all the outlets, they're mostly Ivy League educated, they're highly educated, they went to the best schools, they're intellectuals, and that's why the Daily Caller, for example, which is very conservative, started by Tucker Carlson, and is the most popular thing on Facebook, news site, more than any of the others, because regular people, regular working people in this country, the people that Trump likes to talk to in the suburbs, etc., those people feel like the elites run the country, and they feel like the elites run the media. So that's why they are, I don't know if the word's excited or happy, that they feel like there's a place for them at Fox or with the Daily Caller or wherever that talks to people like them. And that's dangerous in a democratic republic, because we're a government by and of and for the people. We're not a democracy in the pure sense, because that's mob rule, right? That's majority wins. We don't do that. We believe that the minority has a voice in our system of government. And so we've really lost our way, which is why I wrote my last book, because I wanted us to get back to the fundamentals of why America was even founded in the first place. What were we doing? What were we saying? What were we all about? And I think we've lost that. And that's what has me very worried, because we're very tribal right now. I don't know, Nicco, if you see it differently, but that's how I see it.
No, we are very tribal right now. And it's a pretty hard problem to solve, in part because there's a great book by Bill Bryson called The Big Sort, where he basically documents how since 1980, we've sorted ourselves demographically, that prior to 1980, you were much more likely to live next to someone who made a lot less or a lot more money than you. You were much more likely to live in a neighborhood with someone who had a very different educational profile than you. You were much more likely to live in a neighborhood where somebody had a different political views than you. But we've sorted ourselves geographically, creating a kind of, I'd say, a deep challenge. I think Kelly Chen in the questions was asking about she zeroed right in on this as a weakness to the local news model. I do want to change gears a bit. There was a question I lost track of somewhere from someone about encroaching on free speech. And that this is a common conservative argument that you don't want to encroach on free speech. And I'm all for free opinions. I don't think I don't think you can, Patrick Moynihan, you're entitled to your own opinions, you're not entitled to your own facts. And I could rattle off a dozen falsehoods that Sean Hannity has promoted that have ruined people's lives, that are outright false. And that's just not okay. He can have opinions about them, but he can't say things that are demonstrably factually untrue. Now that's complicated by a president who says things that are demonstrably factually untrue every day. Right? I mean, I think it's kind of a fundamental question about integrity in our society today, and it's kind of disturbing. But I do have a kind of radical view on free speech that both liberals and conservatives hate me for, and that is that I think the First Amendment and free speech are obsolete. That I just don't think it matters anymore. That the original idea, the environment in which the First Amendment was written to protect speech, was an environment where it was pretty hard to have speech. You had to have a lot of money to buy a printing press and paper and ink. And then, you had to have a lot of money to buy a TV station or a radio station. Speech was very hard to come by, actually. But in the age of the internet, and it was hard to come by, which is why the Supreme Court and the framers of the Constitution protected it so aggressively. But today there is no barrier to free speech. And in fact, the opposite has happened. Misinformation and lies overwhelm our conversations online. They pollute everything and they make it impossible to get to the truth and impossible even to have a reasonable discussion. And so I think we have to think very differently about free speech in the digital age, because I think the rules have just fundamentally changed.
Well, I agree with that, and I think, and Jamie just cut me off when we were going past too much time here, but I agree with you. Not in the sense that I think it's obsolete by any stretch, but I do think that you're spot on, and that's why Facebook and all these platforms, YouTube, and these companies are under such scrutiny, because people have literally lost their lives with people perpetuating hate groups. Dylan Roof, take a look at what Dylan Roof was doing on Facebook before he went and massacred 9 human beings, Black human beings, 2 of which were my sorority sisters in Charleston, South Carolina, 2015. Massacred them in a church of people that welcomed him in for prayer and treated him with respect because he hated Black people. He didn't like the Trayvon Martin thing, and whatever it was, he's got a Confederate flag and he's doing all stuff, but they're being stoked up by these groups on Facebook because they find now you can, back 30 years ago, you couldn't find groups of people that were like you that weren't easy to find, to your point, because you can take out a newspaper ad? It's different now. And so I think that there are going to be a lot of rules about what we can and what we can't say on the internet. And I think it's coming soon, because I do think that it's gotten to be not only just polluted, Nicco, to your point, but it's gotten to be dangerous. I have to have, when I speak, me, and I'm not even as big as some of my friends on TV and otherwise, I have to have men with me that are security with weapons because my life has been threatened so many times. And the vile stuff that I get in my inbox and on, it's unbelievably unbelievable. And people put their pictures on this stuff and they don't mind that you know where they live or what they do. That's the environment we live in right now. And that's a very different kind of speech. And it scares me actually, because I don't want our speech limited for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I want Sean Hannity to be able to talk. I want Tucker to be able to talk. I don't have to agree with them, but I do want them to tell the truth, to Nicco's point, which is have your conservative point of view, whatever, but don't lie to us. Don't tell people that COVID is not contagious and that it's not deadly. I lost an aunt to COVID-19. And many of you have lost loved ones, friends, and family members, or been sick with it yourself. So the point is that you're right, Nicco, but I don't know how we stop people from lying. The president lies every day a lot. And I'm not saying that that's demonstrably true. He just lies. And nobody seems to care anymore, actually. That worries me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is a thought-provoking way to sort of wrap things up, that there are a lot of things we need to continue to mull over. I'd like to come back to the opening thoughts you had. Sophia, you asked us to think about the state of our democracy and what we can do as individuals to make a difference. And Nicco, you pointed to these things we need to be cautious about and the way we're consuming information about the outcome of the election. In a minute or less, what's the story or what's the practice of media consumption you think we most need to focus on? What's your one piece of advice as people move forward between now and Election Day?
I'll close with this. The thing that has me most concerned right now is our division and our division over race. You know, America is the story of us. It's all of us. It's not some of us. It's not your country. It's not my country. It's our country. And I think that what we have to do in this moment is harken back to something that John Adams said and wrote long ago. And he believed that one of the most important things to make this republic last was that we have moral and virtuous leaders. Now, we can debate all day what moral and virtuous government means and moral and virtuous leaders mean. But I think we've gone down a slippery slope. And as I ask the question, what can we do to protect our democracy, our country, and to love each other and to take care of each other and to look after each other? We've got to actually start looking at the kind of human beings we put in office. And that's Democrat, Republican, Independent. The character of the man or woman, it matters. I'm not talking about perfect human beings because they don't exist. I'm talking about human beings that have lived life, that have worked jobs, that have maybe lost something, experienced bankruptcy, had health challenges. We've got to get back to the public square again. I've used that phrase a lot this evening because I want you to remember that phrase. If you're over 40, you know what I'm talking about. If you're a younger person looking at this, you're like, what's she talking about? I'm talking about the us, the we the people of the United States of America in order to form a more perfect union on this Constitution Day. We've got to get back to we the people telling Washington what to do. We the people telling the state legislatures what to do. And that requires us to be engaged and informed and self-governing. And thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you. Nicco, closing thoughts?
Well, one thing I have a couple close downs, three things. One, I'm nervous about the media in this election because they like to election day have an answer. It's like a game and they want to know who won. But I don't think we're going to know election day. I don't even think we're going to know the day after election day. And the media needs to really resist the urge to drive it into like, today is the finish line, who won, photo finish, because would be disastrous. We are the only industrialized democracy that expects immediate results on the election. In places like Germany, it can take a week to 10 days to know what happened. And like slow counting is accurate counting, but the media does not want slow counting. So that's something I'm pretty worried about. I think, we live in crazy times, and I've said I have an email newsletter, and I'll put the link if you like my rant, and you can read it. I put the link in the chat, nicco.substack.com. But I always go to rule one. It is going to get crazier. Nobody has any incentive to behave here. There are no, the Democrats, Republicans, the media, they don't have incentive to behave. Until they have an incentive to behave, it's going to get crazier. And it is up to you and me and all of us to create that incentive through our participation in the political process. I also want to say that, you know, my experience with William & Mary and of the Washington program in particular really launched me into my career and my work. And it's very important to me. And I hope everybody listening who's able to financially support the program does so, because it really made a very big difference in my life and my career.
So it's wonderful. Thank you both so much. I know my wheels are going to be spinning thinking over everything you've said. So we really appreciate your time and your insights and your generosity in sharing those with us. I'd like to turn things over to Erin Battle, who I think is going to wrap up the evening for us. So Erin, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much to Professor Settle and Nicco and Sophia for joining us this evening. And I think I speak for our whole team and hopefully for all of you that are watching and saying that this was a wonderfully engaging and thought-provoking conversation. I hope for all of us that we have a few really key takeaways. And for those of you that are tuning in for the first time to something that we in the Washington Center are doing, I hope that you all enjoyed just a little bit of a taste of what our students get to do when they're enrolled in our classes. They get these kind of experiences left and right, facilitated by wonderful professors like Professor Settle and wonderful guest speakers, again, like Nicco and Sophia. Before we close out, I wanted to give everyone a chance to hear from a recent but former study in DC student to just talk a little bit about his experience and why classes like this are meaningful to him and have made a difference in his life and his academic journey. So I'm going to really quickly, for just a couple of minutes, turn it over to one of our peer ambassadors, RJ Hewitt, who participated in a couple of our programs, and he's just going to tell you a little bit about his experience and what the Washington Center means to him.
Thanks, Erin. How are y'all doing today? My name is RJ Hewitt, like Erin said. I'm a senior here at William & Mary, graduating in August, majoring in government and minoring in educational studies with a focus in policy and equity. I participated in the fall 2018 and winter 2019 DC programs, the first of which was public policy and anthropology in DC, and my winter seminar was on urban education. And like Erin said, I'm serving as a DC peer ambassador for the college this year. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you. I am a scholarship recipient. During the winter 2019 winter seminar, I did receive the scholarship, and it allowed me to participate in that program, which really helped shape my interest in my career, in building my career, building up to when I graduate in education. So during the fall 2018 semester, I got the opportunity to intern with Lawyers Without Borders in Washington, DC, where I helped to create teaching aids for law enforcement and lawyers and litigators and judges in a lot of developing countries, including like Jamaica and Kenya and some other countries. So a lot of the things that I valued and I took away from those two programs was the opportunity to experience life in DC. I'm born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. So I'm kind of used to a big city, but nothing to the scale of Washington. And now I'm in love with it. I love this. I love DC. I love the Capitol. I love experiencing life on the Hill. And that's something that without the Washington programs, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to experience. Erin and Roxanne and Elizabeth and all the DC staff, they're all great. I've fallen in love with them over the years. I'm now applying to participate in my third program with the Washington Center. So I'm hoping that I get the opportunity to do that this coming up summer. So yeah, if you all find it in you to please give to the scholarship fund so other students can have the same opportunities that I have. I know I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure the students here at the college will appreciate it as well. So thank you all. I hope you all enjoy your evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, RJ, for sharing your story. We really appreciate and love you, and kudos to you for going for the 3-peat. That's pretty rare, but we love it. So in the chat, Elizabeth just shared a link to any of you that are interested in potentially donating to our scholarship fund. You can do so there. 100% of the money that goes to our scholarship fund goes to scholarship recipients. So our Study in DC Scholarship Fund supports all of the students that come through and do academic programs with us. As many of you at home know, DC is not a cheap and easy place to live, and that is even more true for students that are at a financial disadvantage. And so the scholarship fund recipients are all need-based, and they are all ones that we think are deserving of having some time in DC to work, to learn, to intern, and to live. And so if you're so inclined, please consider making a donation to the scholarship fund. Again, as Roxanne said at the top of this program, we're doing this event in lieu of our normal fundraiser due to COVID times. And so we would really appreciate it, and our students would absolutely love it. For those of you that just want to get involved with the W&M Washington Center, whether that's through mentorship or being an internship supervisor, or just wanting to come and network with students, we definitely have ways that you can do that as well. You can just visit wm.edu/dc/volunteer, and you can sign up to be a volunteer there. We have a volunteer portal that we pull from pretty regularly. And so we'd love to see more faces come through the center and engage with our students. And of course, if that's something that you're interested in, please consider signing up there. So as we sign off, I just want to say one last big thank you to Professor Settle and Sophia and Nicco for spending the evening with us, both from everyone that's attending and from our team in the Washington Center. For those of you watching at home, we hope to be able to engage with you in person soon, fingers crossed. We can see you, but in the meantime, know that the Washington Center is here for you. We are not only the campus in the city for students, but also for alumni. So if there's anything that you need, or if you want a connection with W&M, we are definitely the place to do it. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We hope to hear from you soon, and I hope you have a great evening.